Thank you, Hannah, and welcome to this event at Intelligence Squared with Martin Puchner. Martin is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University and the author of a large number of books on literature, cultural history, and philosophy, amongst which I will just mention a few, such as 2017's The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, and Civilizations, and 2020's The Language of Thieves, about a secret code language targeted by the Nazis for elimination. But we're here tonight to discuss his most recent volume, which, as Hannah mentioned, is Culture, A New World History, which is now out from Norton in the US and from Ithaca here in the UK. I'm going to start the conversation with Martin in just a second, but there are a few housekeeping details which I thought I would share with you before we begin. So tonight's event is going to run for about an hour, and for the first 45 minutes or so, Martin and I are going to be having a conversation about the book and the issues that it raises. And then I'm going to be taking your questions. You can start asking them at any time by clicking on the Ask Question button under the screen and typing in your question. If you want your name to be mentioned when asking the question, then type it into the box and press send. And as Hannah said, please do tweet at us during the course of the event and afterwards using the hashtag IQ2. So, Martin, thank you so much for joining us and for doing this event this evening. I'm going to start by just getting a sense of how you embarked on this absolutely immense undertaking. And it is a book of enormous scope, chronologically, geographically, and thematically. So it moves from ancient Egypt in the beginning to K-pop in the end, from Mughal India to medieval Germany, taking in poetry and sculpture and anthropology and prayer and ritual and all sorts of things along the way. So, what prompted you to undertake this, and how did you go about starting to think about such an utterly vast topic?
Yes. Thank you, Edward. It started a couple of years ago in a context where people, especially who are in the humanities, in academia, we spend a lot of time wringing our hands about declining enrollments. And I think people generally in arts and culture, people don't care about arts anymore. What's wrong? What's going on? And, I spend a good deal of time bemoaning all of these things as well. But then at some point, I kind of paused and realized that I had actually never really asked myself some of these fundamental questions about culture, such as why do we engage in this sort of non-utilitarian activity? How does culture actually work? How did it proceed? What are the big arcs? What are the big themes of this human endeavor? And so, then the pandemic hit and I, was stuck at home and I thought, well, I have nothing better to do. Why don't I do it now? So I sort of dug in and tried to go as broad and wide, Edward, as you said, I ended up doing in order to sort of distill some of these important moments, turning points, sort of moments that sort of illustrate to me how culture really works. And I wanted to do that, not in a big survey, but to sort of select these compelling case studies, about 15, and then tell them in a kind of narrative and sort of interesting, immersive way, hoping that out of the sequence of them, out of these different sort of case studies, that bigger picture that I wanted to sketch would somehow emerge.
Great, thank you. Yeah, as you say, it's part of one of the solutions, or one of the potential solutions to declining admissions or enrollment is bringing the joy back. And I think this is one of the things that the book does very well, is bring the joy back. And also in an age of hyper specialization, where the tendency is to focus on quite small things, to think about these really big questions about what is culture and why should we preserve it. You said something in there which I want to come back to and press you a little further on. So one of the ways in which the book is structured is by focusing on moments of transmission, and what I think you call special places and institutions of meaning making. So places where culture is stored, and reproduced, and so on and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit about why we might choose to look at culture in that way, as opposed to looking at moments of creation, or something like that?
Yeah, fair enough. No, and it's at first I didn't quite know what to emphasize, and so I really looked all over the place trying to think about different case studies. What emerged as a sort of through line, and transmission, as you say, was one. And in a way, going back to the basics, the very perhaps banal fact that culture is not transmitted automatically. Unlike our genes that transmit our human genome to the next generation, when it comes to cultural knowledge, we have to devise external storage media and ways of making sure that cultural knowledge gets transmitted to the next generation. And because otherwise it's lost, and it so much is lost all the time. So for me, storage and transmission became crucial. And so, one place where I started is with cave art, and the Chauvet cave in particular. And in part because these cave paintings are so amazing and 30, 40,000 years old, produced over a long period of time. But above all, I started to think of these caves as sort of one of the first storage places where culture and cultural knowledge was stored and transmitted to the next generation. And then, of course, there are others, libraries and universities and the internet and other technologies that fulfill that function. But caves and temples and theaters and other such institutions and places and storage technologies became central.
Yeah, and I think part of the experience of a lot of beauty, and artistic beauty is no different than any other, is a sense of ephemerality, the sense that this extraordinary thing that you're holding on to might simply disappear. I wonder whether also looking at moments of transmission does something to solve part of the problem of what we do with historical works of art, right? In that, you and I both, as literature professors, know that we are often caught in an enigma between trying to discern authorial purpose. What did the creator of this work mean? Which is often something that you can never quite get to and never be quite certain about, on the one hand. And on the other hand, throwing it, wildly open to kind of reader reception. What did people take this to mean? Which, to a certain extent, almost suggests that the work has no, that there's no responsibility to the work of art. So I wonder whether, choosing moments of transition was a kind of halfway house in some way.
Yeah, Edward, it's a very interesting way of putting it. I think you're right. I do have some moments of creation. For example, the Egyptian sculptor Thutmose, who creates this extraordinary sculpture of Queen Nefertiti, and so I dwell on that, and that is sort of one of the early chapters. But then, even more fascinating to me is the fact that that whole episode in Egyptian history, which was so radical because Queen Nefertiti invented a new god, left Thebes, started a new city, invented a new aesthetics of representation, how that episode was deliberately erased from history by subsequent dynasties, perhaps because it was too startling and too revolutionary, and how it was then rediscovered and reinterpreted. And so these moments of broken transmission, where something is lost, where something gets interrupted and then is rediscovered after a break, those became, to my mind, not exceptions, but really the rule. And it's very rare to find a genuinely continuous cultural tradition. There are always these interruptions and breaks. And so that became a special dynamic that really stood out for me. And so I think I tried to find as many episodes that look at that dynamic from different perspectives. Another one is a pillar by the Indian king Ashoka, a pillar he had inscribed in order to present a kind of Buddhist idea of Buddhist kingship that was very important to him, had become very important to him. and he erected these massive stone pillars in order to propagate this new belief and also to speak both to the future, and he hoped to export Buddhism uh, uh, abroad. After a while, the pillar became illegible, but then that didn't stop people from going to it, interpreting it, trying to understand why is this massive pillar there. Subsequent rulers find it, transport it to Delhi, then finally it's rediscovered and reinterpreted. So those are stories that I emphasized. I think precisely because of what you mentioned, Edward, namely that it's of course fascinating to think about these moments of creation. But the reason why we humans create cultural products which are not there for our survival is because of this kind of collective intergenerational process of meaning making. That's never complete. That's never at an end. That's ongoing, but apparently really crucial to us because we do it wherever we live. And so it seemed to me to get at that dynamic, these stories of transmission and rediscovery were more important, or at least as important, as just celebrating the originality of artists.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the things that I found, most fascinating in the book is the part that you talk about, the part that you see error and misunderstanding playing in the transmission of culture. So whether or not there are breaks in transmission, even if you're successful in keeping something in a kind of locked box, the context in which it was originally understood disappear, or they degrade, and suddenly it doesn't mean the same to the person who opens the box. So that old kind of new critical fantasy of the well-wrought urn in which you can put poetry and you seal it up and it comes out fresh as a daisy 400 years later is of course a fantasy, because it doesn't mean the same to everyone. But so just to quote from the book, you write that errors are the way in which a culture experiments, allowing new generations to project their own concerns onto the past and to inject urgency into its continuation. I wonder if you could start by giving us a few examples of this kind of creative misinterpretation that you're thinking of. You've already given us one with Ashoka and his pillar, but if you can say a little bit more about that, and then we can talk perhaps a little about what we can do with that idea.
Yeah. So as you say, errors became crucial, and it's odd because as a teacher and researcher, I try to get things right, and in the book, I try to put things in their original context to help myself and readers understand where these things come from. But at the same time, this theme of error really stood out, and it seems to me in the end, efforts to minimize errors and misunderstandings are probably misguided because they can be so generative and have been. So I just mentioned Ashoka, where people, once the inscription became illegible, nevertheless continued oral stories about who might have erected this pillar and what it might mean. And travelers come and encounter it, and there are legends, oral legends of various kinds. And we now know that they are not technically true, but these pillars are almost like magnets that attract cultural production, so to speak, stories, interpretations, and that perhaps is more important than getting it right. Another example is this. So you mentioned locked boxes. I actually became obsessed with sort of time capsules, because the Chauvet cave with which I start, gets sealed up and then doesn't get open for about 30,000 years. And it is sort of like a time capsule. Another time capsule is Pompeii. Often these are moments of destruction that paradoxically also preserve a moment of culture. And that was true with the eruption of the volcano in Pompeii in AD 79. One of the things that we know, thanks to the volcano, is that there was this Indian statue, or South Asian statue, that was found in Pompeii, and you can retrace the story of how it probably got there, and it has a lot to say about trade between the Roman Empire and Asia, but it's also clear that small statue of a female goddess probably was part of a history of misunderstanding. It's very likely that the Roman owner of that statue probably thought she was a version of Venus or the Greek Aphrodite, which is not technically true, but that's just part of that history of interpretation and making something that's foreign or from the past your own, understanding it with your own cultural horizon, and that's most likely what happened to the statue as well. And there are many other examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're absolutely right. There's so many examples, fantastic examples of this in the book, in the ways in which, for instance, the bust of Nefertiti that you begin with becomes this provocative thing for Freud and Thomas Mann and so on and so forth, despite the fact that in many ways their historical understanding of these objects would now probably not be understandings that would be particularly respected by modern archaeologists and ancient historians. The revision, and yet how productive it was for them to think through and with these objects was important. I mean, I wonder again how you approach this as a teacher, in a sense that, as you said at the beginning, we are to a certain extent in our role trying to, if not set limits upon interpretation, I suppose ensure that the interpretation is not simply kind of imposed upon the work, that it's sensitive to the historical conditions within which it was created, and yet recognizing the kind of generativity of error. I mean, how do we find a balance between understanding what the object was originally made for, and allowing ourselves the freedom to reinterpret it?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting dilemma. The way I would approach it is to say that I want to, when I teach, but also when I write, I want to put students and readers in a position where they learn things, where they have cultural knowledge about this moment, or about a work that seems relevant and important to know. That seems more important than sort of imposing an interpretation. Because teaching students and readers cultural facts, forces, putting things in context, I think puts them in a position where they can come up with an interpretation that is grounded in knowledge rather than something random. And I would say, in the defense of Freud and Thomas Mann, who then, after the statue gets rediscovered, find themselves super intrigued that there is this moment in Egyptian history that apparently we witness, because of that discovery, a sort of the birth of monotheism, or sort of a protoform of monotheism. And while you're absolutely right, Edward, that some of the spin that Freud puts on this, where he thinks that Moses was an Egyptian, and perhaps Thomas Mann, is speculative. But I would actually say that these artists, in thinking about this cultural moment and writing either a kind of treatise in the case of Freud, or a very long novel in the case of Thomas Mann, contributed to thinking about this episode in history. And I think there are actually current scholars of Egyptology who are quite cognizant of that reception history, and who use it and who interpret it in sort of similar ways, actually. So yes, these were not scholars, but their response to this fascinating moment in history, I think, it was a serious one, and it's still taken seriously. So I think in the end, it's not. I'm not trying to hit readers over the head with interpretations, nor do I do that with students. But I think putting people in a position where they can form their own judgment based on some knowledge, I think that's sort of the goal.
And I think it's interesting how often in the history of culture that what have seemed perhaps at first to be errors of interpretation have later been seen to be kind of intuitions of a deeper structure. I mean, I think the number of times when presumably people were crying cultural barbarianism, saying, this is the wrong way to see this, and when actually, it turned out later that there's a wider agreement with that. So I'm going to move the conversation on now a little bit to address the question that I suppose is being used to structure this conversation, this event, and which, to a certain extent, looms over the book and looms over the question of cultural, cultural artifacts more generally nowadays. This question of who owns culture. So there in the background, I mean, I think there's one way to read this book, which is just as a sort of vast soaring flight over the history of culture. But another way to read it is thinking about these questions of cultural appropriation and cancel culture and so on and so forth that have been such a live part of cultural conversations recently. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the threat to the ways in which culture has historically functioned that are posed by, or the danger that's posed by, some of these current conversations that we're having.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The questions of cultural appropriation and cancel culture and so on and so forth were on my mind as I was writing this book, because this is, if you Google culture these days, most likely some of these terms will pop up. And so I think it shows, among other things, that we are at a moment where we fight a lot about culture. And it's true that sometimes I feel like, oh, I wish we were fighting less. But on the other hand, I think there's something good about it in that people care. They care about culture. This is why we fight about something we care. So here too, I think it's, in a way, I didn't just want to come down on some position in these contemporary debates, but to take a step back and to sort of gain an understanding of how culture works, how is it transmitted, how do moments of creativity emerge, what happens at these moments of cultural borrowing, in order to, again, inform a little bit the debate, perhaps in similar terms from what we just talked about, putting readers in a position where they now have a lot of sort of perhaps interestingly selected historical episodes that they can use in order to think themselves about what are the limits of cultural appropriation, who owns what is legitimate, what is not legitimate. So in the book, I didn't want to say, okay, this is good, this is bad, this is okay, but I wanted to provide a lot of material with which to think about these issues. And so, but since you want to push me to take some positions, and that's fair enough, and because I do think that there are some implications, perhaps, and maybe to select one. I think also cultural appropriation is used in so many different contexts, and so I don't really use it in the book because of it. But let's just select one context, and that's the whole debate about restitution of objects from museums, from the Elgin marbles to statues from Benin and so on and so forth. And I recognize there in this particular context that, for example, arguments of cultural ownership can be quite powerful, to say, yes, Lord Elgin had some kind of contract that allowed him to take something back to England, but it was a little bit murky. And in any case, this was a treaty between two empires, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire. But there are questions that can be asked. The same about the Nefertiti statue that we talked about earlier, excavated by a Prussian expedition. They were allowed to take certain objects home. How they ended up with the statue of Nefertiti, there are some questions about that. And then there are more crasser examples, like in the case of Benin, where objects were taken just under so clearly exploitative conditions of extreme violence and disrespect, and ended up in museums in London and Berlin and New York and other places. So I am, of course, I don't approve of such theft, especially these extreme cases. I also understand that to say, this comes from our culture, you took it under dubious circumstances, please return it, can be a powerful argument. But perhaps one way of articulating one place in which I ended up in this whole question of ownership is to say the goal of the restitution debate shouldn't be that everything just goes back from where it came, because I think that would leave everyone culturally impoverished. Because I do believe, and that's sort of one takeaway point from this whole history, is that cultural borrowing is just the single most important driver of cultural development. So if I were to apply this to the restitution debate, I think I would say something, it may not be very practical, but to say the goal is not just to return everything, but to say, let's return Benin statues as museums have begun to do, but let's send something else with them, and let's come to an agreement about how we can maybe borrow some of these statues back and how they can continue to circulate in a better form to the one that under the conditions under which they were taken, because I do believe that the goal should be more circulation, though perhaps better circulation than less circulation. And I do sometimes worry that getting too stuck on the language of ownership erects barriers that in the end are not helpful to anyone.
Yeah, I agree with you that part of the problem here might be, the tendency to fall back on metaphors of ownership, which is a very vague concept which can range across all sorts of different things. I entirely also agree with you on the need to retain circulation, and in fact, I have also had a pet theory that instead of sending back Elgin marbles and Benin bronzes, that the government should be forced to give them the equivalent number of Turners and First Folios.
Exactly.
And so if there's anyone on here listening who has the power to make that happen, consider that as an option, although it's entirely possible that the Greeks don't want a bunch of Turners. But anyway. Yeah, so I think you're right that there is part of the problem here is about the tendency to reach reflexively towards a notion of ownership, which can apply to some things and doesn't apply very well to others. So again, part of the cultural appropriation debate is perhaps complicated by distinction between objects and ideas. So, thinking as a kind of limit experiment. On the one hand, presumably, you're not telling people to go into the National Gallery and take a Rembrandt off the wall, or to go into bookstores and steal your book. So, there is a way of owning a kind of a cultural object. But on the other hand, there's clearly a reductio ad absurdum on the other side, which saying because the Arabs invented love poetry, which transmitted through the troubadours, that no one should be allowed to, they should have a kind of domaine d'origine contrôlée on love poetry, and no one should be able to write it except them. So there's clearly to a certain extent, absurdities on both ends. So my question is to you about where do we draw the line? Where do we cease to be able to own a cultural object and start to be able to own, and start to have something that really can't be laid claim to by any particular group?
Yeah, I think you're so right. Once you move beyond objects, I think it becomes very hard to use the language, and ill-advised to use the language of ownership, I feel. And so I think actually the more I think about it, the more I really think that it is impossible to draw the line. Who should draw the line? Who should be allowed? Sometimes when it comes to immaterial cultural forms and ideas, the language of cultural appropriation is used, I think, to avoid shallow, or just sort of superficial uses of objects from another culture or from the past. And yes, I'm not, that's not great. I'm not for that. But I find myself harder and harder to press to say, this is good informed use and this isn't. I do think it's important to generate a culture in which people want to learn more about something, even if they find it on YouTube or somewhere, where I think it's okay to say, okay, I don't know very much about this, but it intrigues me, so let's try to find out more about it. And so I'm all for instilling that, but I don't want to be the professor who says, no, 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 you don't know enough about this, or you haven't earned the right to, to write love poetry in this particular style. I just find it impossible to do. And since you mentioned copyright in my own book, uh, I'd say the royalties we authors get are so minuscule that people are actually, I don't want to encourage theft, but no one should feel guilty with respect to me if they steal a copy of my book or find it on the internet in some form. And the thing about copyright, is, it's not a book about copyright, in part because serious copyright protections have only been around for like 130, 140 years. But the key idea about intellectual copyright is that it has expired and it should be very short, so that there are some incentives for creative artists and so on and so forth to make a living, and that's of course important. But that it expires, because the idea behind it is that you cannot individually control this for generations, because culture, in the end, we all own culture together, because it is part of that. I started to think of it almost like a species history of humans, because we keep doing this thing, namely to producing cultural objects, and so I'm quite critical of, especially in the U.S., copyright protections keep getting increased and increased and increased because of the Disney corporations and the other big corporations. And that's, I think, another way of, coming back to what you said earlier, namely that our cultural moment, in this moment of capitalism, we revert too quickly to ownership. And if you look at the history of copyright protections in the last 50 years, it's all been driven by big Disney corporations. And that alone, I think, should give us pause when we use ownership as a kind of crucial way of thinking about culture.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to that and ask a few more questions, but I've got a little reminder to myself here to tell the audience and to remind the audience that you can ask your own questions. About a few more, about 10 more minutes of Martin and I talking, but we'd love to hear your questions about the book, about these questions of culture. So please do click on the Ask Question button below your screen, and remember to press send when you finish typing, and/or please tweet at us using the hashtag IQ2. So I think one of the difficulties here, as you say, in a copyright case, it's important to allow the producer of the art object the ability to earn a living off that. But beyond that, it's quite difficult to say who can lay legitimate claim to ownership of this object. And on the other hand, who. And similarly, when talking about legitimate interpretations, illegitimate interpretations, who can decide on these legitimate, on what constitutes a legitimate or an illegitimate interpretation? And to a certain extent, one always has, one ends up falling back on kind of assertions of authority over an object, and it's not quite clear, on what those things are grounded, right? But I wonder if you had any, if there were feelings of exception, even if ownership of culture is not a useful way to think about this. whether this concept of cultural appropriation, we can maybe talk about some of the more famous stories of this that have come up in the media, whether there are instances of this that you are you're tempted to consider as exceptions to your general way of thinking, or confirmatory cases.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting question. So in the end, I mean, there are lots of moments of cultural contact or someone using something that I think are bad or rife with violence and exploitation. So that there's no question about it. I can come up with 5 million, and there are many stories like that in the book. When the Spanish conquistadors come to encounter the Aztecs and burn down their cities and destroy their books, so that very few survive. I mean, there are a lot of moments of cultural violence that's inflicted here that obviously are terrible. But when it comes especially to the sort of more famous cases that go through the media here and that get labeled cultural appropriation, I think my instinct is to say, let's actually look at what people who use the language of cultural appropriation are trying to accomplish by using this phrase. And I think in most cases, I find that there are actually better alternatives. I mean, one famous case about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago that went through the media a lot in the US, especially the right-wing media, were these students at Oberlin College, a very liberal arts college, that complained that the cafeteria had sort of started an international corner and was offering sushi and banh mi sandwiches. And then, Japanese and Vietnamese students complained that the cafeteria was practicing cultural appropriation. And so, it's very easy to make fun of this, and a lot of people did. And I actually don't want to make fun of it, because if you actually look at the student newspapers, where these students were recorded as saying these things and writing these op-eds, what they actually were trying to say is that this was really terrible sushi. And the banh mi sandwiches, they used the wrong bread, they used ciabatta bread, and it was just really bad food that somehow got put in that international corner of the cafeteria. And so, again, I'm not for bad sushi or these terrible fake banh mi sandwiches that were served. So, but this is a case where I think the argument to make is not, cultural appropriation, because then you are in a situation where you say, should only Japanese students eat sushi, or only Japanese sushi chefs create sushis? But it's sort of an argument about quality and how serious is this engagement with this cultural practice, and where you want to create a culture of engagement and of knowledge, rather than shallow and superficial one, but where in my case, at least, I feel like the much more effective way has to do with quality, and to look at what went wrong here, rather than to use this language of default to this language of ownership that I feel like is actually not very effective to explain what went wrong here. And so I think this is sort of would be my strategy, not to say people who cry cultural appropriation are wrong, but that there may be a better way of thinking about these cases. I don't know whether you have some examples that come to your mind.
I mean, no, I mean, I think you put it well, and I think again, I'm slightly conscious of lapsing back on an economic metaphor here, but perhaps one way to think of it is of the tendency of within capitalist systems of monopolies to grow unless you have mechanisms to ensure against that, and to kind of ensure the recirculation of energy. And if what one is or the recirculation of capital in that sense, and if what one is looking for is the recirculation, the circulation of culture, the sharing of culture, that to a certain extent, what one perhaps does have to guard against is a situation in which a powerful actor with access to means of distribution far in excess of everyone else's, becomes the person who is telling everyone else what their culture is. So again, one example that I suppose I use to think about this is, I think there was a furore a few years ago about Beyonce, and I apologize in advance if there are any Queen Bey fans out there, but Beyonce using henna in a music video or something like this. And on the one hand, this seems a little silly. That you would try and prevent someone from celebrating, whereas she was not trying to mock or undermine the idea of the use of henna hand decoration, and she was obviously celebrating its cultural power and its beauty. On the other hand, part of my mind goes to the cultural use of henna in say India, where it's this it's a ritual which binds together the community because it's something that mothers do with their daughters and grandmothers do with their grandchildren, and the prospect of that some child who spends more time with their iPhone than they do with their grandparent, learning about and coming to associate henna decorations with Beyonce rather than with their grandmother, whilst certainly not something that I'd want to, or I don't think that the kind of legislative and capitalist language of cultural appropriation necessarily fits. It does nevertheless conjure a sadness in me that would be how they would know about it. So I suppose a question is, especially in this modern global hyper-connected environment, how we prevent the world from being kind of flooded with cheap ersatz versions of being flooded with bad banh mi and bad bad sushi, rather than having access to good banh mi and good sushi, and making sure that the traditions which lie at the heart of making that of producing that with kind of love and knowledge aren't stamped out by things that simply have a greater kind of a greater ability to produce quickly and cheaply and circulate more widely.
No, I hear that. I mean, I don't think we'll be able to stop the circulation of lot. I mean, we live in an age of circulation, and I think my instinct always is to say, we can't prevent that anyway, but how can we use it? And who knows what the effects of people learning from Beyonce about this particular cultural practice ultimately are. Since we're now talking about the very end of the book, in a sense, and these cases, internet, this is why I end with K-pop, because K-pop sort of came of age, of course, with the internet. And I mentioned this anecdote where I'm too old to have grown up with K-pop. I think you are too, but
my kids are obsessed with it. But yes,
exactly.
So I have a vague awareness of it.
And so I don't have kids, but lots of friends do, and my nephew was, and kids of friends. And so I mentioned this anecdote. I was actually staying with a friend in Norway, and his kid was, I think, 11 at the time. I show up for breakfast, and the kid is already up and has set his alarm. And 11, 12-year-olds don't want to get up early for school, and he's been up and studying Korean with a textbook by himself because he's been fascinated by Korea because of his K-pop idols. And so yes, you can say, just watching K-pop videos, what's worth that? But you never know what an encounter, a first encounter in a let's shallow or mass media kind of way, what it leads to. And again, this makes me think that we can't adjudicate it that way. What we can do is try to foster, as you put it so nicely, a culture of engagement, of wanting to learn really where does this come from, rather than being content with just sharing a video. And so I think the strategy here is again, it's not one of cultural ownership, but of cultural engagement, valuing that, instilling that in people. I think that's the way to go.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think I'm talking about some limit cases, and in fact, I think K-pop and BTS, with which my kids are, my youngest son is obsessed, is a very good example of both. To a certain extent, BTS is built on imitations, or was it reformulations of the young Michael Jackson itself. It sounds very much like that, and on the other hand, the fact that BTS is globally dominant suggests that good cultural productions can win out even over capital asymmetries or power asymmetries or whatever. So. There's so many more things that we could talk about, but I've got lots of audience questions, so we need to move on to those now. And as I say, we've got quite a few of them, so I'm going to try and keep Martin to reasonably short answers so we can get through many of them. Let's start with for instance, one from Kemi, who has asked about the role of women in cultural transmission. So has the role of women been overlooked, do you think, in the creation and transmission of culture?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, certainly traditionally the way the history of culture has been told, yes, in so many spheres, has tended to overlook women, which is why I try to make a point of not doing that, starting with Nefertiti, and there are the Queen of Sheba, the Kebra Nagast, a text that Edward, you have also written about, a fascinating Ethiopian story of the Queen of Sheba, and as a kind of foundational figure for this Solomonic dynasty, and how that text circulates to other, all the way to George Eliot, and I end with the Future Library, Katie Patterson and Margaret Atwood, that project about writers sealing their stories for 100 years so that they will be released in the future. None of us will be around to read them. So I think that's that was important to me, not just to retell the old story and focusing on the work, or paying continual attention to the role of women was one important thing. The other was to tell not a Western story, but a global story.
Yeah, wonderful. And to say, there's so many wonderful moments in the book with talking about Hildegard von Bingen and other, yeah. Which you see the tip of the iceberg of female contribution to culture, which is often hidden in part because of lack of access to literacy and things like that. So the idea of the old wives' tale, which is written off as unimportant, but which lies beneath much of what we do have that has survived. So to take another great question: how do you think advanced AI will impact culture and creativity? I'm sure you're having the same conversations at every dinner table that I am about ChatGPT and what this means, and is it any good at writing poetry and so on and so forth. So
yes.
What do you think?
No, I think about it constantly, but to my embarrassment, I have to say I change my mind about it about every 5 minutes. And here are the two positions I'm constantly going back and forth between. On the one hand, as I mentioned, I feel like this history is sort of a species history of humans, the producers of culture. And so I think, ChatGPT, it's so interesting because it really emphasizes what's so human about us, how we create these, go through this meaning-making process. AI doesn't try to make meaning of the world, try to understand our place within it, and create these special texts and objects and environments and practices to do so. So somehow this story I told of culture and of humans as a cultural producing species is exactly captures what's unique about us humans rather than AI. So that's and I get a warm fuzzy feeling when I tell myself that when I make that argument to myself and maybe to some of my friends. But then a second later, and here we come back to the theme of borrowing. If there's one takeaway point from this book is that originality is totally overvalued. You can look at any object or any traditions and you see that it's made from bits and pieces of other traditions. So that's hence my emphasis on borrowing, on latecomers, on the circulation of culture. And that's, in a sense, exactly what ChatGPT or AI does. It takes bits and pieces and puts them back together. And this is what we humans have been doing all along. So suddenly, we humans look like, less good versions of ChatGPT or just different versions of ChatGPT. And so that I haven't quite puzzled that one out, but those are the two positions I always find myself oscillating between on a several times a day.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating question, but it can also be that these kinds of things, these kinds of challenges, can be a catalyst for culture in the way that the
Absolutely.
the impressionists were responding in some ways to the need to do something that a camera couldn't,
Right.
and so maybe the next challenge is to find something that ChatGPT can't do culturally.
Or use ChatGPT to do something that we haven't done before, because it's, in the end, it's a tool, and the history of cultural making is a history of tools. And so that's, I think, in the end, if you hold a gun to my head and said you have to come up with one formulation, it would be that it's just another tool, and we have to learn to do it. And if we will do something maybe really interesting with it.
Yeah, I agree. So interesting times ahead. I'm going to move
Mm.
to another question. So this is another pretty broad one. Um, how important do you feel religion has been in the transmission of culture?
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm glad this question gets asked. It is a broad one, but one of the problems of using terms like culture or literature or the arts is that these tend to be relatively recent inventions. And if you go back, and this is why I ended up with this also broad notion of culture, which I sort of define essentially as meaning making or meaning seeking activity. And if you go that broad, because otherwise, with cave art, is that religion? Is it art? Is it, are these exhibition? Is this a gallery? It's very clear that it's very dangerous to bring these terms to especially the distant past. But in the end, that's what we have to do to some extent. So since I this deliberately went broad enough and vague enough not to impose very recent sort of distinctions about, let's say, art and religion, you cast a very wide net, and including religion. And so starting with Nefertiti, the history of Buddhism plays a big role. We just mentioned Ethiopian Christianity. There's a chapter on the golden age of Arabic letters in the Storehouse of Wisdom in Baghdad. And so absolutely, I think religion is part of, even central to this history of meaning making. And it often, especially in the more distant chapters, it's impossible to disentangle art from religion. I think it's part and parcel of it. And I'll just leave the answer at that.
Great, thank you. Moving on to another question. This is to a certain extent, I suppose, a continuation of some of the things that you were saying, and I'm going to kind of develop the question a little. So this is a question from Arthur, who asks about the theory of Black Athena, which argues that the roots of Greek civilization lie in Egypt and the Near East. And again, if you think about, I think you talk a little bit about Plato going to Egypt to seek knowledge and so on and so forth, and that idea that cultural transmission has its roots. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and also about the idea in the book that culture is often something that is sort of worryingly elsewhere, and you feel the need to kind of travel towards it.
Yeah, no, I think that Black Athena story is really great because it disrupts something that I'm also trying to disrupt, namely some idea of culture, of especially of Western culture, that goes like this: that somehow it imagines culture as a relay race, and the Greeks have the baton of culture, and then they pass it on to Rome, and then I don't know, Rome passes it on to Europe, and so on and so forth. And you realize just how much we try to enlist the past and tell these simplified stories of cultural transmission. And so the story about Black Athena and the relationship between Greece and North Africa, it interrupts that. This is why I have this chapter on Ethiopia, to interrupt that story that somehow sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have literary scribal traditions. So I think it's very important to realize that certain ideas of especially high culture that were developed in the UK and in Europe, especially in the 19th century, are just really wrong. And if you look at a broader and truly global history of circulation, you realize exactly how important North Africa was for Greece, for example, or the contact between the way in which Ethiopia borrows from and then develops further these ideas of monotheism from the Middle East, and how that in turn in the 20th century has an afterlife with the Rastafari movement, and so on and so forth. So these more complicated, but also so much more interesting stories, and also, I think, more accurate, and here I will use the term more correct and accurate stories of culture, that completely wrong-headed ideas of, the Western world, often racist conceptions of cultural history, completely ignored and left out, and really simplified in a misleading way how culture has really circulated and transmitted. And the story of India and Rome would be another example. So great question.
Yeah, and I think the entire the energy put into attempts to build kind of neat cultural genealogies, kind of monocausal cultural genealogies, is in some ways an expression of the anxiety that individual cultures don't necessarily really exist. That actually, when you look at the borders of them, or even look at the heart of them, they're so so blended and so multi-causal.
Yeah.
So on, that it's very difficult to say that something even exists at the heart of it. We're almost out of time. I'm looking for a question to end with. I'm afraid this isn't a simple question. It's one that you've sort of addressed before, but I think it's a good note to end on. About this is from Jess, asking if you think that objects of cultural significance should be in so-called universal museums or returned to the communities where they were originated. And so I suppose this is a closing question about place and culture and globalism.
I mean, it's hard to come up with one rule to adjudicate all cases, and I think that I mentioned Benin statues, where it's clear that these cultures in West Africa, where so much was taken from them, and that it's so clear that they need cultural objects as well as ideas and immaterial practices to connect to their own past and to figure out which parts of it are important and not important, and so on and so forth. So I do think that sometimes demands for restitution are very legitimate, and not just because, and again, maybe not even primarily for ownership questions, but because it's very clear that these communities really have a vital interest and need of these objects. So absolutely. At the same time, I also think that it is important and should be in the interest of all cultures to have bits of their culture circulate more widely, because it's a way of having influence, of often ensuring a kind of cultural survival. The story of Buddhism I tell is one, where it originates in India, then sort of declines in India, but fortunately it was exported to China and it thrives in China, and then it sort of diminishes in China and it gets transported to Japan where it thrives, and so on and so forth. And these are, so as a culture, I think in some sense you want to be taken up by others, though hopefully in a non-exploitative and also non-shallow way, of course. So I think this is maybe the note to end on that
Yep,
that
I'm afraid it's a perfect note to end on, and it's perfectly timed as well since we're out of time. So I think I will draw it to a close there just by thanking you. So my thanks to Martin Puchner and to our audience and to Intelligence Squared.
Thank you so much, Edward.
Thank you so much, Martin and Edward. That was such a rich and fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. It's wonderful to hear you to move away from the ideas of cultural ownership and appropriation to cultural transmission and engagement. And if you do want to know more, here is the book available in all good bookshops now. So from all of us at Intelligence Squared, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.